There is a place in the heavens where light becomes so overwhelming that it no longer reveals, but instead erases. A place where the brilliance of the star drowns everything behind it, not in darkness, but in a shimmering veil of radiance so intense that even the sharpest instruments fall into silence. For ages, astronomers have mapped the visible sky. Rarely do they consider the regions where visibility itself collapses. Yet it is in these hidden corridors of light that some of the oldest cosmic mysteries reside. Among them is the story of a world that should have been lost forever. A world that stepped behind the sun and lingered there, waiting. Tonight we enter that world, the world the ancients called Nibiru, the world the Anunnaki once called home, the world that began its long descent into silence long before any human civilization opened its eyes to the sky. Before we journey any deeper into this forgotten world, take a moment to settle in with us. If you are enjoying the atmosphere so far, feel free to tap the like button and share where you are listening from tonight. The images you see simply set the mood. The story itself lives far beyond them. Thank you for being here and for keeping these forgotten worlds alive with us. The earliest myths describe a wandering star, a strange companion to the sun that appeared once in an age, shining with the colour of embers cooling in the dark. Many dismiss those ancient stories as metaphors for comets or distant celestial fires. But the descriptions were too detailed, too synchronized across continents, too persistent to ignore. They spoke of a world that emerged only when the heavens aligned, a world concealed not by distance, but by light itself. To understand how such a thing could be possible, we must first understand the nature of the space behind our star. It is not empty. It is a region where the magnetic field of the sun twists space into narrow corridors of heat and distortion. In these corridors, light bends, signals fade, and gravity behaves in quiet and unpredictable ways. Scientists call these regions the solar shadow zones, areas where objects can glide unnoticed along the back of the sun's radiance. To the ancient skywatchers, however, these zones were known by another name, the blind sky. Nibiru learned to drift inside that blindness, not through magic, not through illusion, but through an orbit unlike anything in our system. It followed a path that leaned so close to the solar glare that its presence was drowned by the pulse of the star. It was a hidden world, wrapped in a corridor of molten light, and for thousands of years it survived within that impossible sanctuary. But every hidden world contains a story, and every story contains a fracture. Before the collapse, Nibiru was a world of deserts and oceans, mountains shaped by ancient winds, and skies filled with shimmering auroras that danced in colours our eyes can barely imagine. From the ground its heavens glowed with shifting veils of crimson and gold, as though the sky were woven from living fire. To its inhabitants these lights were not mere weather, they were signals from the core of the planet itself, signs that their world lived and breathed with them. Yet even then the signs were beginning to shift. The first change came so subtly that only the oldest scholars noticed it. The auroras shimmered a little too long. The rhythm of the magnetic pulse drifted by a fraction of a beat. Nibiru had always possessed a wild heart, a core that pulsed with energy deeper and older than anything the Anunnaki fully understood. But this time the pulse did not correct itself. It wavered, it thinned, it changed. The elders described it as the trembling of a sleeping giant. Others felt it more intimately, as though the ground beneath their feet carried a tone they could not name. Entire landscapes seemed to breathe differently. Days grew slightly shorter. Winds bent in unusual directions. Animals migrated earlier than expected. None of these shifts were dramatic, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns, the Anunnaki believed, were the language of a living world. Still, no one imagined that these signs marked the beginning of the end. From a distance, Nibiru moved with grace, gliding through the solar corridor with the elegance of a great silent ship. But deep under the crust, forces were gathering. There are moments in the life of a world when the visible sky hides the truth beneath stone. A planet may appear calm while its core twists in quiet revolt. Nibiru entered such a moment. The corridor that once shielded it had become its prison. The orbit that once hid it had become unstable. And the light that once protected it would soon reveal the first cracks in its fate. Yet the Anunnaki did not know this. Not yet. They continued their rituals. They lit their crystalline towers. They listened to the hum of their world, believing it would continue as it always had. But every dying world leaves a whisper, and Nibiru had begun to whisper. It murmured in the shifting of the tides. It sighed in the trembling of stones beneath ancient cities. It flickered in the crimson glow that lingered across its skies long after nightfall. And for those who listened closely, the message was unmistakable. Something deep within the planet was stirring, something old, something irreversible. Before long, the Anunnaki would understand. Before long, they would face the truth that no civilization ever wishes to confront. A world can hide from the universe, but it cannot hide from its own death. And on the horizon of that understanding waited a choice that would shape the destiny of two species, two worlds, and the stories that bind them across the ages. For now, we stand at the threshold of Nibiru, a world drifting behind the sun, a world entering the first faint tremors of its final era. And soon, we will see what happens when a planet begins to fall from within. For a long time, the changes were small enough to ignore. Worlds do not collapse in a single moment. They dim the way a fading fire dims, slowly at first, then all at once. And Nibiru, proud and ancient, began its descent in subtle breaths. The first sign was the shift in the planetary rhythm. Nibiru had always possessed a deep internal pulse, a resonance that echoed through stone, air, and water. The Anunnaki believed this pulse was the heartbeat of the world, a signal from the molten core that kept their calendars aligned and their sky towers tuned to the magnetic currents. Every sunrise carried a tone. Every night a quiet countertone. Together they created the cycle of balance that shaped the life of the planet. Then, one evening, the tone faltered. It was not loud. It did not shake the cities or fracture the sky. It was a moment so delicate that it passed unnoticed by all but a few. A slight hesitation in the rhythm. A pause where no pause had ever existed. In the great observatories, the elders leaned toward their crystal instruments, frowning at the faint discrepancy. The younger scholars dismissed it as noise. The elders said nothing, for they understood something the younger minds did not. The pulse of a world does not change unless something beneath the crust is stirring. In the days that followed, the hesitation grew. Winds altered their patterns. Clouds drifted in unfamiliar spirals. Ocean tides rose a little earlier, receded a little later. Migratory creatures that followed ancient pathways changed direction, flying south a week before the usual season. Farmers noticed that the soil felt warmer at dawn. Energy towers required recalibration. The auroras shimmered in erratic curtains of red and violet, as though trying to send a warning no one wished to hear. Nibiru was beginning to speak. At first, the Anunnaki tried to explain the changes through familiar models. Orbital variation, magnetic shifts, atmospheric cycles. But each cycle they tested collapsed under the new data. The world was not moving the way it once had. The patterns were not aligning. Something deeper was at work. The first tremors arrived soon after. They were gentle vibrations, felt more in the bones than in the ground. A soft shiver passing beneath the feet of those who walked the crystal avenues of the capital. A long, low note that vibrated through the pillars of the oldest temples. Lamps flickered for a moment. Bridges hummed with subtle tension. The tremors were not violent. They were unsettling, like the breath of something vast awakening in the dark. In the lower chambers of the planetary research halls, the elders gathered around the core monitors. The readings made no sense. The energy signature of the core had shifted by a fraction of a frequency, tiny on the surface, catastrophic to those who understood the consequences. The inner flows that stabilized the crust had begun to twist out of alignment. The core was not cooling, it was changing rhythm. One elder placed a hand on the sensor wall and closed his eyes. The panel beneath his palm vibrated in a pattern he had not felt in centuries. When he opened his eyes, there was a weight behind them, a quiet truth, unspoken and unwelcome. The heartbeat of Nibiru was failing, but the Anunnaki were not a species that surrendered easily. They had survived cosmic winters, orbital storms and tidal events in their distant past. They believed, as all great civilizations do, that their world was stable, enduring, ancient beyond threat. The idea that their planet could be entering its final era was unthinkable. And so they did what all civilizations do in the early stages of disaster. They observed, they measured, they reassured themselves that the signs were temporary, but the world continued to shift. As the core drifted further from its natural frequency, the skies responded. Storms formed from stillness. Strange fire-like columns rose from distant mountain ranges, glowing for hours before fading into thin metallic ash. Rivers steamed in the early mornings, even when the air above them was cold. Nights carried a taste of iron. The auroras no longer danced in graceful lines, but tore across the sky in jagged sheets of colour. The people felt it long before the scholars admitted it. Children asked why the air hummed at night. Animals refused to sleep under open skies. Craftsmen found their tools vibrating on stone tables without reason. It was as if the entire world had started breathing with a different chest. Yet the most striking sign came from the stars themselves. For countless generations, the Anunnaki aligned their temples and towers with celestial paths. These alignments were precise, refined across ages. But now something had shifted. The night sky no longer matched the old maps. The constellations were slightly off, the angles a fraction skewed. No telescope malfunctioned, no lens had cracked. Instead, the planet itself had tilted by an immeasurable but undeniable margin. Nibiru was losing balance, and with this imbalance came the first waves of fear. A quiet fear at first whispered in the corridors of knowledge halls. But fear grows, and it grew quickly, because the more the Anunnaki studied the changes, the more they realized something extraordinary. The instability was not external. No passing body, no solar phenomenon, no cosmic drift explained the rhythm shift. The collapse was coming from within. The world was turning against itself, gently at first, then with gathering intention, like an ancient creature long dormant, stretching toward wakefulness. Not everyone accepted the truth. Many still believed the shifts were temporary. Others placed hope in their technology. But the elders knew. They had lived long enough to sense the pattern. World cycles do not lie. And this cycle had broken. Nibiru had entered the first stage of a planetary collapse, a collapse that would unravel its crust, distort its orbit, darken its skies, and force its gods to face a choice no civilization ever wishes to encounter. Stay on a dying world, or abandon the only home they had ever known. Before the tremors reached the great cities, before the skies tore open in crimson arcs, before the Anunnaki understood the scale of what was unfolding beneath them, the first clues appeared far beyond Nibiru itself. They appeared in the silent mathematics of the heavens, in the long arc that defined the planet's wandering journey. Nibiru was never a world of simple orbit. From the beginning, it followed a path that defied the quiet symmetry of the inner planets. Its trajectory stretched deep into the outer dark, looping in a long eccentric sweep before curving back toward the sun. For ages, this orbit was stable enough to sustain life, stable enough to carry civilizations across epochs. But it had always been delicate, always one shift away from fracture. That fracture had begun. Thousands of cycles earlier, subtle distortions appeared at the edges of Nibiru's path. At first, the deviations were so small that not even the most precise instruments could detect them. Gravity tugged at the world from distant bodies, reshaping its speed, its tilt, the angle at which it rose into the heliomagnetic corridor. The Anunnaki believed these distortions were temporary. They believed their world was adapting, recovering, correcting. But a world does not correct itself indefinitely. It accumulates, it remembers, and eventually it breaks. The first evidence of this break appeared not on Nibiru, but in the deep void beyond it. Strange objects drifted toward the inner system. Fragments of ice, shards of metallic stone, elongated bodies reflecting faint and unfamiliar signatures. Some moved with unusual rotations. Others travelled along paths that did not match any known comet family. A few approached the sun briefly, then slipped away again, as if following the echo of a long-forgotten orbit. Centuries later, these fragments would be catalogued by humans as Oumuamua, as interstellar visitors, as anomalies that came from distant stars. Yet their shapes, their trajectories, their unexplainable accelerations all carried a quiet familiarity to those who had once charted Nibiru's fractured path. These were not random wanderers. They were echoes, remnants, debris caught between gravities, following an ancient route carved by a collapsing world. Nibiru had begun shedding pieces of itself long before the Anunnaki realized what those pieces meant. As the orbit destabilized, gravitational tides struck the planet with increasing force. These were not immediate catastrophes, but slow distortions. The outer layers of the world flexed. Stress accumulated in the crust. Over thousands of years, entire regions shifted by fractions of degrees. Mountain ranges creaked under unseen weight. Oceans pulled at their shores with odd intensity. Even the magnetic field, the shield that wrapped the world in protective currents, developed micro-fissures. But the most startling discovery came when the elder astronomers mapped these distortions onto the path of the orbit itself. The orbit was splitting, not into separate worlds, but into overlapping gravitational echoes, like a melody breaking into harmonics. Several potential paths layered over one another, each tugging at the world in a different direction. The planet no longer followed a single clean trajectory. Instead, it drifted along a fractured arc, one segment pulling slightly ahead, another dragging behind, all of them weaving into a pattern that grew more unstable with each passing cycle. This phenomenon would one day be called the fractal orbit theory. To the Anunnaki, the implications were devastating. A fractured orbit meant unpredictable tidal forces. It meant irregular solar exposure. It meant violent shifts in seasons. But worst of all, it meant that the heliomagnetic corridor, the narrow river of charged particles that hid the planet behind the sun, was no longer aligned. Nibiru was slipping out of its sanctuary, and if the world emerged even briefly from the corridor, it could be detected. It could be exposed. The cloaking field, magnificent as it was, could not protect the planet if the orbit deviated too far from the radiation stream. Without that alignment, the bending of light weakened, the thermal signature brightened. The world risked casting a shadow where no shadow should be. For a civilization that lived half its existence hidden behind the sun, exposure meant danger, not from humans, who at that time had not yet risen, but from others, older watchers of the sky whose attention the Anunnaki did not welcome. This fear pressed upon the rulers of Nibiru, even as the deeper danger lay within the planet itself. As the orbit fractured, so too did the fate of the world. Both Enki and Enlil saw the signs, though each interpreted them differently. Enki viewed the orbital distortion as the symptom of a deeper illness within the core. He believed the instability could still be studied, understood, mitigated. To him, the fractured orbit was an opportunity to map the collapse and possibly slow it. Enlil saw something else. He saw a warning, a world losing its path, a civilization approaching the moment when loyalty to home becomes irrational. In the fractured orbit, he saw the first argument for abandoning the planet, even before the crust had begun to break. The people of Nibiru, however, knew little of these debates. They watched the skies with rising unease. They traced the paths of constellations and realized that something older than memory was shifting. Traditions tied to the positions of stars began to fail. Rituals that aligned with planetary cycles lost their meaning. Even the younger generations sensed a drift, a quiet disorder moving beneath the surface of what had once seemed eternal. Before long, the distortions grew visible. Sunlight bent strangely at the horizon. Dawn arrived too early in some regions, too late in others. Shadows lengthened in unpredictable ways. The world appeared to tilt ever so slightly, as though reaching for a balance it could no longer find. And then came the moment that confirmed their fear. During a rare alignment of the outer moons, the great observatories recorded a shift in the path of Nibiru that should have been impossible. A subtle wobble, barely measurable, but clear enough for every elder to see. The orbit was no longer holding. Nibiru was drifting into a new gravitational pattern, one that would lead it toward instability, one that would expose it, one that would eventually tear at the crust, the oceans, the sky, one that would force a civilization to confront its fate. The Anunnaki understood then what few civilizations ever realize in time, that the path of a world can break long before the world itself does. And once the path fractures, the destiny of everything upon it begins to fracture as well. Nibiru was entering the second stage of collapse, the collapse of its orbit. And with that collapse, the foundations of an ancient civilization began to tremble in ways no technology, no knowledge, no hope could easily restore. Long before Nibiru began to fracture, long before the tremors rippled across its continents, the Anunnaki had mastered a form of concealment unlike anything known in the modern age. To most civilizations, invisibility means darkness. To the Anunnaki, it meant the opposite. They learned to hide their world not by retreating into shadow, but by stepping deeper into light. The cloak of light was the greatest achievement of their astronomer engineers. It was not designed to hide people or ships or structures. It was designed to hide an entire planet, and it did so by bending one of the most fundamental laws of perception. Light reveals, but enough light blinds, enough light erases. The Anunnaki studied the luminous storms that erupted near the sun and discovered a region where light behaved strangely. In this space, the heat of the star was so intense and the radiation so dense that objects became distorted. Outlines blurred, reflections collapsed. Even the most advanced instruments failed to distinguish shape or distance. It was a sanctuary in plain sight, a veil made not of darkness, but of overwhelming brightness. They called it the corridor of brilliance. The cloak of light worked only within this zone. It did not make Nibiru disappear. Instead, it folded the planet's thermal signature and curved incoming light around its surface. To distant observers, the world became nothing more than a ripple in the solar radiance, a shimmer drowned in the heat, indistinguishable from the background roar of the star. To activate the cloak, Nibiru had to align with the solar radiation stream that flowed along the corridor. When the alignment was perfect, the world vanished into the brilliance. When the alignment wavered, the edges of the cloak flickered like the fading outline of a mirage. For thousands of years the cloak worked flawlessly. The orbit carried Nibiru through the corridor in long, predictable arcs. The Anunnaki drifted unseen behind the sun, emerging only during rare windows where the path shifted just enough to reveal a crimson glimmer on the horizon of ancient skies. But as the orbit fractured, so did the cloak. To understand why, one must imagine the cloak not as a shield, but as a delicate balancing act. The world had to maintain a perfect relationship with the radiation stream. A tiny deviation in the orbit altered the angle at which the light curved. A slight tilt changed how the electromagnetic field wrapped around the surface. Every shift made the veil thinner, weaker, more unstable. In the deep halls of the light-borne cast, where the cloak engines were calibrated, the first signs of failure appeared as flickers in the resonance chambers. The instruments, once steady, pulsed irregularly. The pattern was unmistakable. The world was slipping out of alignment with the corridor. At first, the Lightborn attempted small corrections, adjustments to magnetic lines, recalibrations of the resonant coils. But these corrections required more and more energy, as though the planet itself were resisting them. The cloak resisted motion. The orbit resisted stabilization. The world resisted its own concealment. Soon the flickers reached the surface. On the floating terraces of the capital, citizens began to notice strange distortions in the sky. Brief flashes of light near the horizon, like glints of metal glimpsed through fog. Heat waves rippling upward at unusual angles. Gradients in the sky bending as though something massive were shifting behind the air itself. One evening, during the long twilight that covered the upper deserts, a faint shimmering arc appeared above the western sky. It glowed red, then gold, then red again, before fading into the pale dusk. The elders recognized the phenomenon instantly. It was the edge of the cloak, and it was failing. For the first time in generations, Nibiru risked becoming visible to the wider cosmos. The fear that spread through the ranks of the Anunnaki was not fear of discovery by humans, for humanity had not yet evolved beyond its earliest ancestors. The fear was of older eyes. The Anunnaki were not alone in the deep corridors of the galaxy. There were other watchers, other navigators of ancient orbits, other civilizations whose histories had crossed, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently, with the paths of the Anunnaki. Being seen at the wrong moment could invite danger. It could spark curiosity from distant empires or awaken old rivalries. It could attract the attention of beings who sought hidden worlds for their own purposes. The cloak had been created not only for concealment, but for protection, and now that protection was faltering. Yet the greatest problem was not the risk of exposure. It was what the cloak failure revealed about the state of the world. If the orbit was stable, the resonance would hold. If the core were calm, the magnetic alignment would endure. If the planet were healthy, the corridor of brilliance would wrap around Nibiru as it always had. But nothing held. The flickers grew longer. The distortions grew stronger. Every day the cloak required more energy to sustain. Every night the Lightborn gathered around their instruments with increasing dread. And every time they attempted to reinforce the cloak, they felt the resistance beneath the crust, the subtle counterpulse that indicated the core was drifting further from its natural rhythm. A world can be hidden only when it wishes to remain whole. Nibiru no longer possessed such wholeness. As fractures deepened and tremors multiplied, the planet began to fight against the cloak, shedding its veils like a wounded creature unable to keep its own shape. It was a silent rebellion, a slow surrender, a message that the Anunnaki could no longer ignore. Their world was not simply destabilizing, it was unraveling. And as the cloak flickered across the sky, bending and breaking in thin sheets of gold, one truth echoed across the great towers of the capital. Soon Nibiru would emerge from behind the sun, not by choice, but by necessity. There comes a moment in the life of every collapsing world when the changes can no longer hide beneath the surface. The tremors that once whispered through the stone begin to rise. The sky that once shimmered with quiet warning begins to tear. And the land that once carried the weight of civilizations begins to shift under its own uncertainty. For Nibiru, that moment arrived without thunder. It began as a thin glowing line. In the early hours before dawn, Travelers crossing the open plains reported seeing a strange radiance beneath the soil. At first the light appeared soft, no brighter than a faint ember, a glow rippling under the darkened ground. But as the night deepened, the line brightened. It stretched across the valley floor like a vein carrying molten breath. It pulsed once, twice, then again, as though something deep beneath the rock was stirring from a long sleep. By morning, the glow had spread. Across entire regions, slender fissures appeared, each carrying the same amber light. They moved like cracks in a sheet of cooling metal, branching in delicate patterns that seemed almost intentional. The light was beautiful. It cast long golden reflections across the mountains and illuminated distant forests with an otherworldly dawn. Children watched it in silence. Elders watched it with fear, for they understood what the younger minds did not. Light should not come from beneath a world. The first great shattering had begun. In the capital, the floating platforms trembled. At first the vibrations were light, almost rhythmic, like the beating of distant wings. But as the sun rose higher, the tremors deepened. Entire terraces shivered. Bridges swayed. Crystalline walkways chimed with harmonic tones that had never been heard before. The levitation rings that held the city above the fiery ground pulsed with sudden bursts of energy, as though struggling to remain balanced. The people gathered at the edges of the platforms, staring at the landscape below. Where once the plains had stretched unbroken toward the horizon, they now saw undulating waves of land. Hills buckled, valleys twisted, rivers bent their courses. What had always been still was now breathing, warping, shifting. The world beneath them was moving. The tremors synchronized, forming a slow planetary rhythm. It was not violent, but the consistency was terrifying. It meant the disturbance came not from tectonic pressure alone, but from the core itself, pushing upward in waves. The crust was responding like an overstretched shell trying to contain a force greater than its design. In the research sanctuaries below the capital, the seismic chambers lit in a cascade of red. The core monitors, ancient devices wrapped in braided conduits of crystal and metal, vibrated with alarms that had never sounded in living memory. The readings were catastrophic. The inner flow had shifted into a spiral pattern. The core was no longer rotating in harmony with the outer layers. It had begun to twist. And when a core twists faster than the crust above it, the planet breaks. The first fractures widened throughout the day. Small settlements in the outer regions reported the ground opening beneath their feet, creating narrow canyons that glowed with molten brilliance. Entire forests tilted as the land beneath them sagged. Millions of tons of stone bent in slow, aching arcs, as though gravity itself were uncertain which direction to pull. But the most haunting sign appeared in the oceans. At midday, the waters along the southern continent began to rise. Not with the violence of a tidal wave, but with deliberate, silent motion. The sea lifted in a long, gentle swell, expanding outward as though pushed from below. Then, without warning, the water fell. It receded in a sweeping retreat, exposing entire stretches of seabed that had not touched air for thousands of years. For a brief moment, the people standing on the cliff saw ancient coral formations, stranded marine creatures, and deep channels carved by forgotten currents. Then the sea surged back. It rushed in like a living force, reclaiming the land with a roar that echoed across the continent. Great waves rose and curled, not in chaos, but in eerie synchrony with the planetary tremors. The ocean was responding to the heartbeat of the dying world. By sunset, the sky had changed. Clouds formed in spirals that mimicked the twisting motion of the core. Red auroras flickered at the equator. Lightning rose from the ground toward the heavens instead of descending from the sky. Thunder murmured not from above, but from beneath the soil. It was as if the planet were reversing itself, revealing the hidden layers of its nature. In the capital, panic spread quietly. The Anunnaki did not scream. They did not run. Their fear was not loud. It was steady, focused, and ancient. They knew the signs. They recognized the pattern. They understood the meaning of ground that moves with intention. Nibiru was breaking open from within, yet even in the midst of collapse, beauty remained. As night fell, the glowing fissures cast golden rivers of light across the darkened land. The floating city hovered above a world illuminated from within, as though Nibiru were attempting to hold on to its splendor even as it fractured. But beauty cannot hide truth. The first great shattering was not the end. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would grow more violent, more unpredictable, and more devastating. And in the heart of the trembling world, Enki and Enlil prepared for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Nibiru, but the destiny of every world that would one day fall under the influence of their divided legacy. Long before the fractures split the plains, long before the oceans rose and fell in restless arcs, and long before the cloak began to flicker above the trembling horizon, the Anunnaki had already carried within them a quieter fracture. It was not made of stone or fire. It was made of vision, of philosophy, of two minds shaped by the same world yet guided by opposing truths. Those minds belonged to Enki and Enlil. To understand what happened to Nibiru and why its people ultimately abandoned their dying world, we must understand the divide between these two figures. Their conflict was not born in the moment of crisis. It had lingered across ages, subtle as shifting tides, quiet as drifting winds, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And as the planet began to fail, the moment arrived. Enki was known as the keeper of life currents, scholar, architect, engineer, and healer of worlds. His laboratories stretched deep beneath the capital, carved into the luminous stone of the ancient cliffs. There he studied the magnetic harmonies that balanced the crust, the patterns of the core, the resonance of the oceans, and the living memory encoded within the planet itself. To Enki, a world was not a place but a body, a being, a living companion to its inhabitants. If a world suffered, he believed, it could be healed. Enlil was the commander of the skyward citadels, strategist, guardian, and master of order. His domain rose high above the floating platforms, a complex of dark metal arches and soaring towers that touched the upper layers of the atmosphere. From there he directed fleets, monitored celestial patterns, and maintained the defensive codes that shielded Nibiru from the attention of unfriendly civilizations. To Enlil, a world was not a body. It was a vessel, a foundation, a place that must serve the needs of its people efficiently, decisively, and without sentiment. When the tremors began, both saw the same signs, but where Enki sought causes, Enlil sought solutions. Where Enki listened, Enlil measured. Where Enki hesitated, Enlil advanced. The tension grew quietly. In the earliest days of the instability, Enki argued that the disturbances came from deep within the core and could be stabilized if they learned the nature of the shift. He believed the world was entering a transition, not a death. As long as the core still pulsed, as long as the auroras still flickered with life, he insisted that there was hope. Enlil disagreed. He saw the orbital fractures, the cloak malfunction, the rising ocean anomalies, and the trembling of the crust as signs of irreversible decay. In his mind, the warnings were not symptoms. They were declarations. Nibiru was dying. No world that broke from within could be saved. To wait was to risk extinction. Thus the fracture between them widened. Meetings grew tense. Reports became arguments. The Council of Light, long united under the steady rhythms of their ancient world, found itself drawn into the growing divide. Scientists aligned with Enki, believing in adaptation, healing, and preservation. Strategists aligned with Enlil, convinced that delay was dangerous and evacuation inevitable. Still, both understood one truth: neither could act without the other. They were bound, not by authority, but by legacy. Their decisions shaped not only policy, but culture, not only survival, but destiny. Then came the day when the fractures beneath the capital grew large enough to tilt the floating platforms. Not by much, but enough for every soul to feel the shift. Stone groaned. Light dimmed. The wind carried a low tone, as though the air itself were humming in distress. Enlil called an emergency convocation. The great hall filled with the highest ranks of the Anunnaki. Holographic projections of the planet floated above them, rotating slowly, showing red fissures spreading across the mantle. Energy models pulsed with warnings. Orbital simulations collapsed in spirals. Enlil spoke first. His voice was sharp, clear, shaped by urgency. He laid out the data, the trends, the projections. He showed how the orbital corridor had begun to reject the world. He displayed the weakening cloak and the increasing energy needed to sustain it. He pointed to the fractures widening day by day, to the pressure rising beneath the crust, to the risk of catastrophic failure. Then he gave his conclusion. They had to leave. Nibiru, he said, had entered a terminal phase. The world could no longer support life indefinitely. Evacuation was not an option, but a necessity. They needed to begin preparations for a migration across the stars. The hall stirred with uneasy murmurs. Enki rose. His voice was gentler, slower, filled with the weight of an ancient grief. He spoke not of fear, but of understanding. The planet, he said, was not collapsing without cause. Something had shifted in the deep magnetic pathways that sustained its heart. The energy spirals inside the world could be calmed. The fractures could be slowed. The orbit might still be corrected. Life could still continue, at least long enough to restore balance. He did not claim certainty. He claimed possibility. Possibility, he argued, was worth pursuing. He projected his own models. Some were hopeful, others uncertain. All suggested that abandoning Nibiru before understanding the core shift would be premature. The world, he said, deserved their loyalty. After all it had given them, after all the ages it had carried them, they could not turn away at the first sign of danger. But Enlil saw no honour in staying, only risk. The debate ignited. Voices clashed across the hall. Some argued for time. Others demanded action. Some feared the world itself. Others feared what might come if they remained too long. In the midst of the rising storm, the planet trembled again. A low, rolling vibration passed through the foundation of the hall. Crystal pillars flickered. The rotating hologram of Nibiru wavered in its frame. The tremor was not strong enough to cause damage. It was strong enough to silence every voice. Enki and Enlil looked at each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the elder counselor at the far end of the chamber stood. Her voice was fragile, shaped by centuries. She uttered a single truth that settled over the room like falling dust. A world can endure fracture. It cannot endure division. The meaning was clear. If Nibiru was to survive long enough for any future to exist, the Anunnaki could not afford a civil fracture while their world fell apart beneath them. They needed unity, even if unity meant choosing a path that none of them wished to face. The leaders left the hall carrying the heavy beginning of that truth. For the first time in countless ages, the gods of Nibiru walked in silence. The divide between Enki and Enlil had become the divide that would define the fate of a world. There are moments in the life of a world when silence becomes its own kind of prophecy. When the tremors pause, when the winds settle, when even the sky seems to hold its breath. These moments are rare. They are deceptive. They are the stillness that arrives not to reassure, but to prepare. Nibiru entered such a stillness on the night that would later be remembered as the last night of calm. By then the fractures had already spread across the continents. The oceans had risen and fallen in strange tidal breaths. The auroras had torn into jagged crimson arcs that no longer resembled the graceful lights of earlier ages. And yet, on this night, everything grew quiet, unnaturally quiet. Across the floating terraces of the capital, the air felt almost weightless. The glow of the levitation rings, which usually shimmered with steady pulses, softened into a gentle, even light. The crystalline walkways, always humming faintly with resonance, fell silent. Above the towers, the sky turned a soft shade of gold, diffused and warm, more like the memory of sunlight than sunlight itself. The people emerged from their dwellings, stepping into the calm as though stepping into a dream. Children pointed upward, puzzled by the quiet sky. Elders closed their eyes, feeling the absence of tremor beneath their feet. Scholars watched their instruments in disbelief as the readings flatlined into perfect symmetry. For the first time in many cycles, nothing shook. Enki walked alone along the upper balconies of the research sanctuaries. He placed a hand against the crystal rail and felt no vibration. For days the world had spoken to him through shifting rhythms. Now it was silent, too silent. The silence did not feel like peace. It felt like a held breath, a moment suspended between motion and collapse. He lifted his gaze toward the auroras. They moved slowly, softly, like curtains drifting in a gentle wind. Their colors were muted, pale pink and violet instead of deep crimson. The sky was beautiful again, in a fragile, wounded way, as if it remembered what it had once been. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was his daughter, Ninsar, one of the youngest scientists assigned to the core analysis teams. Her eyes reflected the soft lights above. "It feels healed," she said quietly. Enki shook his head. He knew this stillness all too well. Worlds, like living beings, sometimes quiet themselves before undergoing a deeper shift. The calm before the breach. "Not healed," he murmured, resting. And then, more softly, "or preparing." Far above the capital, Enlil stood in the upper citadel, staring down at the illuminated city. The calm unnerved him. He preferred motion, data, signs that could be interpreted. This silence was neither warning nor reassurance. It was nothingness, and nothingness is harder to command than chaos. He turned toward his officers. "Begin the evacuation prototypes," he ordered. Quietly, no public alarm. His officers hesitated. The city was calm. The people were calm. But they obeyed. The division between Enki and Enlil was now a quiet pulse moving beneath every action, shaping every decision. Below, the city glowed like a floating constellation. The terraces reflected the tranquil sky. The air carried a soft, luminescent haze. Families gathered on open platforms, watching the horizon, as though expecting the world to reveal some hidden message. For a brief moment, Nibiru looked timeless again. A world suspended in beauty. A world that seemed impossibly whole. That evening, the elders convened in the Star Hall. Its crystalline pillars rose like frozen waves around them. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, the great hologram of Nibiru rotated in silence. The fractures glowed in faint amber lines, but even those seemed subdued, softened by the calm. One elder placed her hand upon the central orb. It did not tremble under her touch as it had the previous days. She looked at the others. "It wants to give us this moment," she whispered. This one final pause. They stood together in the quiet, each feeling the gravity of her words settle over them. A world does not calm itself without reason. A world does not offer beauty before its darkest hour unless it wishes to be remembered that way. Outside the hall, musicians gathered in the lower gardens. They played ancient harmonic instruments, letting soft tones drift upward through the terraces. The music mingled with the faint glow of the fracture lines far below, creating an atmosphere so serene that some believed the worst had passed. For a night hope returned. It was fragile, like the light of a lantern in a storm, but hope nonetheless. The stars emerged clearly for the first time in cycles. The constellations held their positions without distortion. The twin moons reflected pale light across the mirrored lakes. Even the winds whispered softly through the crystalline forests. It was, in every sense, a perfect night. But perfection, on a dying world, is its own kind of warning. As the sky dimmed toward dawn, the golden haze began to fade. A thin vibration stirred beneath the ground. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but those who had lived long enough felt it immediately. Enki opened his eyes. Enlil turned toward the horizon. The elders lowered their hands from the glowing orb. The calm was ending. Somewhere deep beneath the crust, the twisting core gathered its strength for the next phase of collapse. And when the first light of morning touched the trembling plains, Nibiru exhaled in a long, resonant sigh. The last night of calm was over. Dawn arrived differently on the day the star hall fell. Instead of rising in its usual steady arc, the sun broke across the horizon in a fractured shimmer, scattering uneven rays of gold across the trembling plains. The light bent strangely, warping against the air as though passing through invisible cracks. The calm of the previous night dissolved instantly, replaced by a thin vibration that hummed through the stone and drifted up the levitation towers like a warning carried on breath. Throughout the capital, the Anunnaki stepped onto their terraces, sensing the change before understanding it. The world was no longer resting. It had resumed its struggle. Far beneath them, the ground pulsed in slow waves, rising and falling with the rhythm of something ancient pushing upward. And from the higher platforms, those who studied the horizon watched the first signs of distortion forming around the great star hall. The star hall was the oldest structure on Nibiru. Part observatory, part temple, part harmonic engine, it stood at the heart of the floating capital, anchored by crystalline pylons that reached deep into the planet's magnetic currents. For hundreds of thousands of years it had never shifted, never dimmed, never swayed. Its central beam, a pillar of concentrated light, had always aligned perfectly with a particular point in the heavens, marking the cycle of the world. It was said that as long as the star hall remained straight, Nibiru would remain stable. That belief ended on this morning. At first the tilt was subtle, a slight lean, barely perceptible, except to the most trained eyes. But as the tremor beneath the world deepened, the star hall shifted again, and again, each movement small but unmistakable. In the upper citadel, Enlil stared at the distant structure with a tension that tightened every line of his face. "How much has it tilted?" he demanded. An officer checked the readings. 2.6 degrees. Enlil exhaled sharply. Anything beyond 1 degree was unthinkable. Anything beyond 2 meant structural collapse. But the officer was not done. It is increasing. Across the city, Enki stood with a team of scientists on a high veranda. He watched the star hall sway in slow motion, the beam of light warping as though bending under a weight it had never carried before. The tremors were not random. They were rhythmic, coordinated, resonant. "The core is spiraling faster," Enki murmured. His daughter Ninsar looked at him with fear. "What does that mean?" Enki did not answer. Some truths do not soften when spoken. As the sun climbed higher, the world answered for him. Another tremor struck, this one stronger than any before. The levitation rings beneath the city flared in a burst of energy as they strained to keep the platforms level. Light rippled across the walkways, bending and refracting like heat over metal. The air itself seemed to vibrate in uneven harmonics. Then the star hall emitted a sound no living Anunnaki had ever heard. A low groan. Deep, hollow, ancient. The pillars that held the hall aloft shuddered. Cracks of white light shot up their sides like veins of lightning trapped within stone. The great beam at the top flickered, sputtered, then surged with blinding brilliance before dimming to half its strength. Crowds gathered across the terraces, watching in stunned silence. For the first time in their history, the Star Hall was failing. A structure aligned perfectly since the First Age was no longer able to hold its place against the shifting world beneath it. The foundation had begun to slip, not by design, not by erosion, but because the core of Nibiru was deforming the magnetic lattice that kept the city stable. A planet in rebellion was reclaiming all that rested upon it. Enlil gave the order instantly: seal all citadels, activate defensive grids, prepare evacuation rings. His officers rushed into motion, but the city itself answered faster than they could. Alarms pulsed through the upper platforms. Energy conduits flickered. Bridges retracted into protective shells. Even the floating gardens folded inward like petals closing around a sleeping flower. Meanwhile, Enki walked toward the Star Hall. Those around him tried to pull him back. "You cannot go inside. The structure is collapsing." Enki shook his head. "A world speaks through its oldest places. If I do not listen now, we lose our last chance to understand." Ninsar followed him. She would not let him go alone. Inside the Star Hall, the rhythmic hum that had once filled the chamber with serene resonance was now broken, jagged, desperate. The great holographic sphere that displayed the heartbeat of the world flickered wildly, the fractures glowing brighter than ever before. Enki traced his hand along the central crystal column. It vibrated violently, like a pulse out of control. The world was screaming. "We are out of time," he whispered. Outside, the final shift occurred. The ground beneath the capital heaved, not with the sharp violence of an earthquake, but with a long rolling motion that tilted the entire platform. The Star Hall swayed dangerously. The luminous cracks along its pillars widened, spilling blinding threads of golden light into the air. Then the foundation gave way. Not in an explosion, not in a collapse of dust and rubble, but in a slow, heartbreaking descent. The Star Hall leaned, its great beam bending like a tree bowing under an impossible wind. The glow at its summit flickered one last time, casting a trembling arc of white across the sky. And as thousands watched in breathless silence, the oldest structure on Nibiru fell from its perfect alignment. It did not shatter. It did not crumble. It simply sank into the failing harmonic field, descending in quiet surrender, as if acknowledging the truth the Anunnaki had long refused to accept. A world that could not hold its oldest pillar could no longer hold itself. The fall of the Star Hall was the moment denial ended. It was the moment fear crystallized into certainty. It was the moment every Anunnaki understood that Nibiru had crossed the threshold into irreversible collapse. No more questions, no more doubts, no more waiting. Their world was dying, and now they had to decide what their people would become when it finally let go. The fall of the Star Hall broke something deeper than stone. It broke certainty. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Anunnaki had believed their world would endure, not because of arrogance, but because Nibiru had always endured. Through orbital winters, magnetic storms, and the long drifting arcs behind the sun, the planet had remained steady beneath their feet. It had carried them through ages. But on the day the Star Hall leaned out of alignment, that belief finally collapsed. All across the capital, the air felt different, heavier, slower. Even the light seemed to move with hesitation, bending through dust that had not existed the day before. The city floated unevenly now, its platforms tilting by fractions that the people felt in their legs and in their breath. Doorways no longer aligned perfectly with bridges. Crystalline walkways hummed under strange magnetic stress. It was as though the entire city were holding on with trembling hands. The summons came soon after dawn. A deep harmonic tone rang across the floating capital, resonating through every tower and chamber. It was the call of the Great Council, a summons rarely used and reserved only for the gravest of decisions. The Anunnaki turned their faces toward the central spire, knowing the moment they had feared was finally here. Enki arrived in silence. Enlil arrived in armor. The council hall, suspended above the city by massive magnetic pylons, glowed faintly with shifting light. Patterns carved into the floor activated as the members entered, linking their presence to the ancient archives embedded deep beneath the surface. For a moment the hall felt timeless, untouched by the chaos outside. But the illusion was thin. Cracks of dim light crept along the walls, widening with each tremor that rippled upward from the dying world. At the center of the chamber, a sphere of golden energy formed. It was the planetary hologram, a fully synchronized projection of Nibiru's internal and external states. Normally the sphere rotated with calm precision, its surface a smooth representation of land, sea, atmosphere, and energy currents. Now it flickered violently. Fracture lines glowed like molten scars across the continents. Magnetic streams twisted into tangled spirals. The core pulsed irregularly, sending chaotic bursts of light through the hologram. What once represented a living, balanced world now resembled a wounded organism fighting a losing battle. The councillors took their seats. Enlil did not wait. "We cannot pretend any more," he said. His voice carried the sharpness of a blade. "You all saw the star hall fall. You felt the platforms tilt. The orbit is broken. The cloak is failing. The core is unraveling. This world cannot be stabilized." Enki raised his eyes but did not speak. Not yet. Enlil continued. "Every model we have confirms the same truth. Nibiru is entering terminal collapse. If we remain, we will fall with it." He motioned to one of his commanders. The lights dimmed. A second hologram appeared beside the first, showing a projection of the collapse timeline. It was not a distant threat. It was accelerating. Enlil let the silence settle before concluding, "We must leave this world." A murmur rippled across the hall. Some councillors lowered their heads. Others clenched their fists. A few, mostly younger officers, stood rigid in acceptance. But most sat frozen in the terrible weight of what had just been spoken aloud. Enki finally rose. The world listened. His voice was softer, but every word carried the slow gravity of someone who had walked every level of their dying world, who felt its rhythm failing beneath his feet, who still loved the planet even as it turned against itself. "Our world is not only failing," he began, "but speaking. A collapse has a rhythm, a spiral, a message. We should not abandon it before we understand the source. If we leave without knowledge, we carry ignorance into the stars." Enlil responded sharply. "Knowledge will not hold the crust together. Knowledge will not restore the magnetic lattice. Knowledge will not prevent the core from tearing the world apart." Enki studied the planetary hologram. His voice quieted. "There is still something to learn, something essential. A world does not collapse without a cause. If we do not understand that cause, we may carry the same fate with us to whatever world we choose next." This was the heart of their conflict. Enlil believed survival required decisive escape. Enki believed survival required understanding. The council debated. Voices clashed. Some invoked the ancient codes of stewardship. Others invoked the logic of preservation. Some feared the planet itself. Others feared what awaited them beyond the safety of their cloaked orbit. The hologram flickered again. A loud tremor rose from the depths of Nibiru. The hall vibrated. Dust drifted from the rafters. The magnetic pylons groaned with strain. The hologram distorted into a storm of golden shards. The planet itself interrupted the debate. When the tremor faded, the hall settled into a heavy quiet. An elder councillor stood. She was one of the oldest among them, her eyes reflecting more ages than most could comprehend. Her voice carried both sorrow and clarity. We have loved this world for longer than memory. It has carried us through darkness and through radiance. But a dying world cannot be asked to bear the weight of its children forever. If we stay, we will vanish. If we leave, a part of Nibiru will survive through us. This is our truth. She turned toward Enki. You must carry its knowledge. Then toward Enlil. You must carry its people. Unity was impossible. Agreement was necessary. A choice was made. Quietly, painfully, irreversibly. Preparations for Exodus would begin. Not tomorrow, not in weeks, immediately. For if the Star Hall could fall, so could the city. If the city could fall, so could the continents. And if the continents could fall, there would be no civilization left to save. The council dismissed. As they walked out into the trembling light of the fractured day, one truth echoed through every mind. A world can end, but a people must not. The decision to leave Nibiru did not echo in celebration or relief. It fell upon the people with the quiet weight of mourning. A world is not simply abandoned, it is grieved. Even as the tremors grew stronger and the auroras bled crimson across the sky, the Anunnaki moved with a solemn purpose, knowing they were preparing not just for departure, but for the end of an age. Across the floating capital, ancient protocols stirred to life. Panels that had not been touched in thousands of years unfolded from the floors of the citadels. Chambers long sealed by tradition opened in slow, resonant motions. The sound of the awakening mechanisms carried through the air like distant thunder. It was the beginning of an operation spoken of only in myth, a plan designed for a moment the Anunnaki had hoped would never come. The Exodus platforms. They were older than most of the cities, older than the crystal forests, older even than the Star Hall. They existed beneath layers of metal stone, buried deep in the foundation of the capital and across the continents. Massive spiraling structures, their surfaces engraved with harmonic patterns. They were built not for war, not for exploration, but for the relocation of entire civilizations. They did not launch ships. They lifted worlds of their own. When activated, each platform glowed with a low golden light. Rings of carved stone rotated in opposite directions, drawing magnetic fields upward into massive spirals. These spirals formed a funnel of luminous energy capable of lifting vessels into the upper atmosphere without combustion or force. The platforms sang when they awakened, a deep rising tone that harmonized with the resonant fields woven through the fabric of the planet. On this day, as the crust trembled beneath them, the platforms began to sing again. Enlil oversaw the activation of the first. His officers moved in formation. Engineers ran diagnostics along the spiraling conduits. The heat rising from the core caused the air around the platform to shimmer, but the machinery held. He watched the energy surge through the rings, building until the entire structure glowed like a rising star. "Begin preparing the fleets," he ordered. In the docks at the edge of the capital, the ships waited. Sleek vessels made of folded alloys and crystalline veins, they glimmered with silent power. Some were exploration craft carrying vast archives of knowledge. Others were transport vessels shaped to hold thousands of lives. Still others were dark, angular warships built under Enlil's direction in an age when conflict with distant civilizations felt inevitable. The fleets did not launch together. They launched in divisions. Enki's vessels were the first to rise. They glowed softly, their energy signatures tuned to minimize strain on the collapsing magnetic fields. He had instructed his followers to carry the genetic libraries, the harmonic maps, and the ancient records of Nibiru's long history. If the world could not be saved, its memory must endure. As his vessel approached the Exodus platform, he turned to Ninsar. "You must protect the records. They are not simply knowledge. They are the last voice of our world." Ninsar nodded, though her eyes shone with grief. "Will we return?" she asked. Enki placed a hand over hers. That depends on whether the universe allows what has been lost to be found again. The platform's spiraling rings expanded. A column of light enveloped Enki's ship, lifting it slowly toward the sky. The vessel rose with gentle grace, humming in harmony with the dying world. Thousands watched as it vanished into the high clouds, leaving behind only a faint trail of pale blue energy. Enlil's ships launched next. Where Enki's vessels moved like drifting lanterns, Enlil's rose like arrows of dark fire. Their hulls absorbed the golden glow of the platform, turning it into sharp lines of crimson and silver. They carried soldiers, command staff, navigation divisions, and the guardians of the celestial archives. Enlil stood at the bow of his flagship, watching the capital recede beneath him. "A world must protect its people," he said quietly, "even if it cannot protect itself." His officers bowed in solemn agreement. One by one the fleets ascended. Hundreds of vessels lifted from dozens of Exodus platforms scattered across Nibiru's continents. The sky filled with glimmers of light as each ship curved toward the upper atmosphere. The sound of the platforms reverberated across the lands, their humming tones rising into a crescendo that blended with the tremors of the planet itself. But not all could leave. The platforms, vast as they were, could not carry every inhabitant. Millions remained on the surface, waiting for their turn, hoping the world would hold long enough for them to escape. The elders stayed voluntarily, tending to the knowledge vaults and stabilizing pylons. They believed it was their duty to remain until the very last phase of collapse. Across the lower cities, families watched the glowing trails of the departing fleets with a mixture of sorrow and awe. They knew what the Exodus meant. They knew the history of worlds that could not sustain their people, but no amount of tradition or prophecy could soften the moment of separation from home. As Enki's fleet drifted beyond the atmosphere, the planet shuddered. A wave of distortion rippled across the crust. Entire regions bent under the strain. The great crystal forests shattered in cascading arcs of light. Heat surged upward from deep scars in the ground, warping the air into shimmering forms. Enlil watched from orbit, gripping the railing of his command deck. "The collapse is accelerating," he said. An officer turned to him. "Will the last platforms hold?" Enlil lowered his gaze. His silence was answer enough. Below, the capital city flickered. Fountains of energy erupted from the lowest pylons. The levitation rings strained to keep the platforms stable. The once graceful floating architecture wavered as the fields beneath it spasmed. But still the ships rose, determined to save what remained of their civilization. As the final division of the fleet left the atmosphere, the Exodus platforms dimmed. Their spirals slowed. Their tones weakened. The golden light faded into a dull, trembling glow. Nibiru had given everything it could. High above the wounded world, the last ship joined the departing fleet. Together they moved into formation, drifting toward the dark corridor of space that led toward distant younger worlds. Toward a planet that would one day know them not as refugees, but as gods. Long after the final fleets had risen into the sky, long after the last Exodus platforms dimmed into silence, and long after the great capital drifted unevenly above a trembling landscape, Nibiru entered the stage of collapse that only a few ever witness. It was the quiet unraveling, the slow surrender of a world that had carried life through ages beyond memory. The sound of the tremors changed first. What had once been sharp quakes or rolling waves deep beneath the crust evolved into something softer, almost rhythmic, as though the planet were breathing slower with each passing hour. Cracks that had glowed fiercely days earlier now pulsed like dying embers. The golden light within them faded into pale threads stretching across the darkening land. Those who remained felt the change in their bones. The world no longer shook with the violence of instability. It sagged. It exhaled. The pressure that had once torn at the continents shifted into a kind of stillness that was far more terrifying. For this was the stillness of a world letting go, Among the many who stayed behind were the elders, ancient beings whose lives spanned epochs. They had chosen not to flee, not out of resignation or defeat, but out of duty. In their belief, every world deserved witnesses to carry its final memory into the long corridors of time. To them, Nibiru was not simply a planet. It was a companion, a teacher, a living archive of cosmic history. To abandon it in its last hour would be to abandon themselves. They gathered in the fading capital, walking slowly along the tilting platforms as the levitation fields flickered beneath their feet. The city no longer hovered with its former grace. Some platforms dipped noticeably toward the ground. Towers leaned at angles that would once have been unthinkable. Bridges made of crystalline stone flickered with fragments of their once vibrant colours. The elders moved toward the Star Hall, or rather what remained of it. The great structure had not collapsed completely. Instead, it had sunk into the weakened magnetic grid, resting partially on the fractured stone beneath. Its once brilliant beam was now a faint wavering glow, barely visible against the twilight sky. Yet even in its brokenness, the Star Hall radiated a solemn kind of beauty. When the elders approached, the remaining energy within its pillars flickered awake, as if recognizing them. They entered the hall quietly and stood beneath the dim ceiling where constellations had once been projected in shimmering detail. One elder placed her hand on the central column. The vibrations were weak, fading, but still present. The world was still speaking, though its voice had thinned into a whisper. "Nibiru is tired," she said softly. Another elder nodded. "Worlds do not fear death," he replied, "only being forgotten." They activated the Star Hall's final sequence, a harmonic preservation pulse designed to record the resonance of the planet at the moment of collapse. The pulse would echo across space, not as a signal for rescue, but as a memorial, a final signature of the world that had nurtured them. Outside, the sky dimmed into hues of deep violet and red. Strange arcs of energy drifted across the horizon, remnants of the magnetic lattice warping under the stress of the core. The twin moons hung low, their surfaces reflecting the distorted glow rising from the fractured planes. The air hummed faintly with a sorrowful tone, as though carrying the memory of all the ages that had come before. The final light of Nibiru rose from the heart of the planet. It began as a slow illumination along the deeper fractures, spreading upward in graceful lines. Entire mountain ranges glowed with warm radiance, valleys filled with shimmering mist. Rivers reflected the internal light in wavering ribbons that stretched across the land like forgotten pathways of fire. From orbit, the departing fleet saw their world shine one last time. Enki stood at the viewplate of his vessel, watching the radiance expand. His expression was not one of triumph, but of grief. This was not the light of a living world. It was the final bloom of a planet exhausting the last of its inner fire. Enlil observed from his command ship in grim silence. Even he, hardened by necessity, could not look away. For all his certainty, for all his resolve, the sight of his home collapsing in such beauty struck him with a quiet ache he would never admit. One of his officers approached. "Should we record the collapse?" Enlil did not turn. "No," he said. "Let it remain what it is, a memory." Below, as the light intensified, the elders gathered at the outer edge of the fallen Star Hall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the glow ripple through the horizon. The moment had come. In the deepest chambers of the dying world, the core weakened. The energy spirals collapsed into chaotic patterns. The magnetic field flickered like a lantern struggling to remain lit. Then, with a long, trembling breath, Nibiru released the last of its strength. The world dimmed. The fractures faded from gold to pale silver, then disappeared into the dark. The shimmering mist settled. The trembling stopped. The hum in the air dissolved. A silence deeper than anything the elders had ever known fell across the land. One elder closed her eyes. "It is done," she whispered. High above, the last rays of Nibiru's internal glow drifted into space, scattering like tiny sparks carried away by cosmic winds. In the ships that now carried their people toward distant worlds, the Anunnaki felt a subtle pulse run through the metal and through their bones. A final message, a final farewell from the world that had given them life. Nibiru had died, but its memory had not. And as the Anunnaki turned their gaze toward the stars ahead, they carried with them the last light of their lost home, a radiance that would shape countless myths on the young world they were about to encounter. Long before humans carved symbols into stone, long before cities rose along fertile rivers, long before myths took shape around campfires, the sky changed in ways the earliest ancestors could neither name nor forget. For a brief moment in the deep past, another world drifted close enough to Earth to leave an imprint on memory itself. That world was Nibiru, entering the final curve of its fractured orbit before disappearing behind the sun for ages. When Nibiru approached, the changes began quietly, just as they had on the dying world itself. Animals sensed it first. Migratory birds altered their routes without warning. Herds moved restlessly across plains as though guided by instincts older than their species. In caves and shelters across continents, early humans looked upward, disturbed by the strange tension in the air. They felt something watching them, something vast, something awakening behind the horizon. The sky darkened in unusual ways, not with storm clouds, but with a faint red haze stretching across the early dawn. Nights carried thin streaks of light that pulsed irregularly, like distant fires burning in the heavens. The stars trembled at the edges of their positions, shifting by fractions too small for modern eyes, but unmistakable to ancient skywatchers who knew every season, every constellation, every pattern of the heavens. Then, without warning, the seas began to move. Along coastlines that no longer exist, water retreated in long, unnatural breaths, exposing ground that had been hidden for millennia. Fish glimmered on bare sand. Coral towers glistened beneath a sky they were never meant to see. Some early humans wandered onto these newly revealed stretches, drawn by curiosity. Others fled inland, sensing danger. Moments later, the waters returned, not with the violence of a modern tsunami, but with a rolling, resonant force rising far higher than the moon could ever pull them. Great waves swept across low valleys. Rivers overflowed. Lakes groaned as if stirred from their beds. For generations afterward, the descendants of those who survived would speak of the day the sea walked away and came back angry. Above them, the sky brightened with a strange new glow. Nibiru revealed itself for the first and only time to early Earth. It did not appear as a distant spark or wandering star. It emerged as a fiery sphere, its surface veined with molten lines, surrounded by a halo of distorted light. The world behind the sun shimmered like a bleeding ember against the deep morning sky. To the people who witnessed it, the sight was overwhelming, beautiful, terrifying. Legends across cultures would later preserve this moment in fragments. In ancient Mesopotamia, it would become the destroyer. In Egypt, the red eye of the heavens. In the Americas, the returning phoenix star. In the Pacific, the second sun that rose only once. These myths are scattered across continents, yet they echo the same event, the approach of a hidden world. As Nibiru drew closer, strange electromagnetic effects rippled across Earth. Lightning danced upward from the ground, shimmering in long spirals. The air between trees hummed with faint tones, vibrating as though touched by invisible hands. At night, some regions glowed with a dim crimson light, even without fire. Early humans believed the sky was breathing. They painted the visions in ochre and charcoal on cave walls, leaving behind images of swirling lights and blazing orbs that modern archaeologists struggle to interpret. One night the moon's path wavered, just a fraction, but enough for the tides to surge again. enough for the sky watchers of that age to point upward in fear, enough for the memory of that moment to take root in stories that would outlive their cultures by thousands of generations. Animals howled without reason. The winds reversed direction. Rain fell as thin metallic mist in some places and not at all in others. Forests rustled in waves as though bowing to an unseen force drifting across the heavens. Nibiru did not collide with Earth. It did not tear continents apart or extinguish life, but its gravitational presence pressed upon the planet in invisible ways, altering subtle systems that shaped the course of early history. The myths that followed were not exaggerations. They were memories transformed into language. Then, as quickly as it appeared, Nibiru faded. Its fractured orbit carried it past Earth and back toward the blinding corridor behind the sun. The fiery sphere dimmed into a distant ember. The distorted halo collapsed into the horizon. The red haze dissolved into pale morning light. But the world it left behind was changed. Across continents, humans began carving the first celestial symbols into stone, recording what they had seen. Entire mythologies formed around the memory of the second sun. Rituals emerged to honor or appease the wandering star. Some believed it foretold destruction. Others believed it promised renewal. All agreed on one truth. Something immense had passed above them, and its shadow had touched the earth. Geological layers support the legend. Sediments show sudden shifts in climate. Ice cores reveal abrupt anomalies in atmospheric chemistry. Magnetic imprints in ancient rock record disturbances that modern science cannot fully explain. Even after Nibiru vanished behind the sun, Earth remembered, and so did the stories that humans would one day tell, passing them from generation to generation, until the memory of a world glimpsed only once became the foundation for myths of gods descending from the heavens, of fiery omens, of cosmic visitors, of ages turning beneath a sky that sometimes changed too quickly. Those stories would shape the earlier civilizations. They would become the first warnings, the first prophecies, the first hints that the heavens held more than stars. And somewhere beyond the reach of human sight, Nibiru continued its long, silent drift into the dead zone of the sun, carrying its survivors toward a new world, toward Earth. A world does not vanish without leaving traces. Even when hidden behind the brilliance of a star, even when shrouded in electromagnetic veils and drifting through cosmic corridors no telescope can penetrate, a world still leaves echoes. These echoes do not reveal themselves in ways that are obvious. They hide in numbers, in patterns, in anomalies, in the quiet spaces between what science can measure and what it cannot yet explain. For centuries, humanity believed the sky was still, predictable, constant, a grand machine following perfect laws. But the sky is not still. The sky remembers. And in recent years it has begun to behave in ways that suggest an old visitor may be stirring again behind the sun. The first sign was faint. Small fluctuations recorded by deep space monitoring arrays, so subtle they were dismissed as instrumental noise. These fluctuations occurred within the solar wind itself, appearing as rhythmic dips in magnetic pressure, a heartbeat hidden inside the roaring storm of particles that flow from the sun. It repeated once, then again, then again. At first the intervals were irregular, then, gradually, unmistakably, they settled into a pattern, a pulse. Scientists debated its origin. Some claimed it was interference from distant cosmic events. Others suggested it came from equipment recalibrations, but the frequency did not match cosmic radiation. It did not match solar flares. It did not match any known planetary effect within the orbit of the inner system, yet it matched something else. It matched the predicted signature of a large body moving through the heliomagnetic corridor, the same corridor that once concealed Nibiru from sight. The pulse grew stronger over time, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably present. Meanwhile, other anomalies emerged. Strange infrared flashes were recorded near the solar limb. Small circular signatures of heat appeared for seconds, then vanished before instruments could lock onto them. At first these were ignored, but as more data accumulated, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. The flashes occurred precisely when the magnetic pulse peaked. It was as though something massive were stepping halfway out of its cloak, revealing only the faintest outline before slipping back into the blinding brilliance of the sun. Then the animals began to move. Migration paths shifted in unusual ways across the globe. Birds flew earlier than expected. Whales altered their deep ocean routes. Even insects that navigated by magnetic fields changed their patterns by measurable degrees. Biologists catalogued the shifts but could not explain them. The timing, however, aligned with the pulse. Just as it had in ancient times when Nibiru passed near Earth. High in the polar regions, rare crimson auroras began to appear, far south of where they should. They formed not in broad sweeping curtains, but in thin vertical arcs resembling the energy veils once described in the myths of the first peoples. Satellites detected unusual electromagnetic spirals above the poles, patterns that mirrored the distortions carved into the oldest skystones of the Andes and the petroglyphs of forgotten deserts. Even the Schumann resonance, the natural heartbeat of Earth's atmosphere, began to behave strangely. Normally stable, it showed brief fluctuations during weeks when the solar pulse peaked. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dangerous, but something unmistakably out of place, like a memory resurfacing in the fabric of the Earth itself. And through all of this, one question grew louder. Is something moving behind the sun? Some astronomers quietly think so. They have studied gravitational anomalies near the heliospheric edge. They have mapped faint tugs in the orbits of distant objects. They have tracked shadows that appear where no shadows should exist. None of the evidence is definitive. All of it is suggestive. Meanwhile, the myths of the ancient world, once dismissed as superstition, have begun to align eerily well with modern data. Civilizations separated by oceans told stories of a returning star, a hidden sun, a wandering world whose reappearance marked the turning of ages. These were not metaphors, they were memories, warnings carved into myth because no language existed yet to describe the cosmic mechanics behind them. If the pulse truly comes from a moving world, if the heat flashes are fragments of a failing cloak, if the sky is reacting now as it did in forgotten centuries, then Nibiru may not be as lifeless as once believed. It may be drifting again, slowly, carefully, inevitably. Yet the question is not whether the world will return. Worlds move along their orbits, whether we witness them or not. The true question is what remains upon it. The Anunnaki left ages ago, carrying their archives, their conflicts, their hopes and their memories to Earth. But a dying world does not necessarily die in an instant. Some structures may remain, some energies may persist, some mechanisms, even in ruin, may be sensitive to alignment. If Nibiru crosses the same corridor again, if it approaches the same window of visibility it once did in the distant past, its presence may awaken ancient devices on Earth. Structures built with resonance and precision, designed not to shine but to respond. Some believe that is why the pulse is strengthening, because something old is listening. As night falls and the world grows quiet, the stars appear unchanged. The moon drifts along its familiar path. The sky looks ordinary, but beneath this calm the sun casts its brilliant veil, hiding mysteries behind its glow. And from within that brightness the faint pulse continues, not a threat, not a promise, simply a reminder. That the universe is not finished speaking, that worlds do not vanish without leaving echoes, and that somewhere behind the light a forgotten world may be turning once more, carrying with it the last whispered memories of a civilization that refused to disappear completely. If you are still here, tell me. Do you believe the sky would warn us if Nibiru began to move again? If this journey through the unknown has resonated with you, feel free to like the video, share it with others who wander the same mysteries, and subscribe for more quiet explorations of forgotten worlds. And in the comments, let us know where you are listening from tonight. Your presence keeps these stories alive.